been around 2 years since Inazuma came out, and along with it came the Raiden Shogun. With the addition of the Fontaine units alongside our introduction to Natlan, is she a unit that is still worth pulling for, or should you skip her completely given that her rerun is just around the corner? Honestly, the answer is that it really depends on your account and you overall. So, Raiden is a DPS unit and most people seem to see her as such, but at the same time, she's also much more than that. While most people seem to view her as an Electro DPS, the other parts of her kit seem to imply otherwise or something more. Her elemental skill can buff the active character's burst, so that actually makes her a buffer. This is especially useful for characters like Shengling, who can snapshot the buff with Pyro Needle, or Eula for her explosion burst damage. Hits from Raiden's elemental burst will restore a flat amount of energy to the entire team, which does actually help relieve their energy requirements. This is especially good for burst DPS teams since it allows you to trade some ER roles for offensive stats such as crit rate, crit damage, or any stat that is relevant to the character like attack, defense, HP, or elemental mastery, etc. While Raiden's damage alone may not be top tier, the utility in her kit makes her more of a burst enabler rather than an actual hyper carry DPS. And if you do feel like her damage is lacking as an Electro DPS build, you can also consider the Hyper Bloom team, or alternatively you can look into her Aggravate team. Now, she's quite nice in the sense that her weapons are rather accessible. We have the Fav Lance for energy hungry teams such as the Raiden National team. We also have the accessible fishing weapon with the catch for DPS Raiden. Of course, that is if you don't mind spending a lot of time just to fish for it. On the other hand, we also have the Dragon's Bane, which is a 4-star gacha standard weapon. You can use it for Hyper Bloom, and her other DPS options would include like Lithic Spear, Deathmatch, and Wavebreaker's Fin at high refinements is comparable to some of her other 5-star options. She also has her best installed artifact set being the Emblem of Severed Fate, which is at one of the most resin efficient domain in the game, sharing its place with Shimenawa. And I recently started messing around with GC Sim in order to figure out the overall numbers and the damage for a team, and here is what I found. From the highest to the lowest, the one that takes the throne right now for an accessible team is the Raiden Double Hydro Hyper Bloom team, netting a 77k DPS with like a sim time of roughly 90 seconds. Of course, Xingqiu, Yelan, and Nahida is built for a DPS build, with Nahida being on field. So I honestly completely forgot about the Furina variant, so I had to go look into Teams DB in GC Sim to find one build, and this particular team with the rotation averaged out to roughly about 69 to 70,000 or 70k average DPS, and the build is as you see of such. So I would say surprisingly, Raiden with Furina in the Quick Bloom teams is actually quite decent, and based on the numbers that we just seen just now in the previous teams, this is actually quite competitive to her best Hyper Bloom team. And of course, we do have the Shen Yun variant, but I couldn't really find anything in GC Sim and I wanted to get this video out. So the Shen Yun Plunge team is very likely going to be decent, but don't take my word about it. It's probably okay, but definitely not going to be as good as her other options. The second place goes to the regular Hyper Bloom team, where Yelan is replaced with Fischl instead, where in the most worst case, the DPS of the team is roughly around 53.7k, and in an ideal or optimized rotation, you can see upwards to 67 to 68k DPS. The third best team for her is the Raiden Hyper Carry team at C0. Granted, you do have C6 Sara, where if you have energy problems, you can see of a minimum of a 43k DPS. In the most ideal scenario where you do not have energy problems, you can see an upwards of 63.2k DPS overall. And followed by that, we do have a tie between two teams, being the Raiden Chevreau Overloader team alongside her Aggravate team with Nahida, sharing the amount of 56k DPS. I've also replaced Bennett with Shengling in the Overloader team, and the DPS is still about the same. Last but not least, we do have the Raiden National team with an average of 54k DPS. So keep in mind that all these numbers are not ideal, as the rotations may or may not be optimal, but I try to be relatively lenient for, I guess you could say, people who don't really want to play the most ideal rotations. And I also try to keep the investment level to roughly 200 CV minimum for accounts that have a decent amount of good artifacts. As great as all these teams are, it simply is not worth running a C0 Raiden as a pure Electro DPS. So unless you have a highly invested Raiden at Constellation to minimum, her damage is definitely not so comparable to some of the other DPS units out there. And if you don't even want to play Raiden Hyper Bloom, that is all the more reason that you should not really consider pulling for her. While her performance is still good after all these years, it's definitely not as insane as some of the most recent DPS units that we've been getting alongside the Fontaine patch and the recent Natlan patch. In terms of her weapons, the Faf Lance is highly contested with other support units, while the catch is mostly just contested with Sheng Ling. And on top of that, if you do want to get a catch, trying to get high refinements or at least even one copy of it does take too much time due to how bad the fishing is in the game. And on top of that, if you want to build for her artifacts, it takes way too much time and resin in order to farm a very high crit value emblem when you can just run a mix set for a hyper boom build and still get a similar level of damage with that amount of investment. So for anyone who might want to consider to go for a few low constellations or low spender constellations, let us quickly review them. Constellation 1 is a quality of life constellation that guarantees Raiden's max stacks for her burst damage. However, it's not necessarily an upgrade if you can already achieve that normally. Constellation 2 is her bread and butter constellation, being the biggest damage upgrade that turns her into a very strong, very viable DPS that you can run in her hyper carry teams. According to Kaching mains, this constellation alone boosts her burst damage upwards of 43%. After running a C2 Raiden, at least my Raiden in the GC sim, the hyper carry team at C2, the damage average are roughly about 75 to 80k DPS only on 4-star weapons alone, so you can imagine how much higher these numbers can go if you do have a 5-star weapon. And lastly, Constellation 3 is a decent damage increase for her burst, and it's generally a good stopping point for any low spenders since any constellation pass here doesn't really contribute much to her damage. Anyways, to close things off, Raiden is still very much a solid unit as times have changed despite the introduction of better DPS unit that we have right now. If you still want to pull for her, do keep in mind that you will need quite a good amount of investment on both Raiden and her teammates if you do want to run her as an electro DPS, and I would say while not as much, you still need a decent amount of investment to play her in her Hyperboom team in order to maximize your damage. Plus, keep in mind that we are still fresh in the Natlan patch, so there may be stronger DPS options out there that may entice you in the future. Anyways, that's it for the video. See you guys. Peace.